Hello. Well, by now you know that we had to cancel all of our activities for Sunday, including our worship services, because of the ice storm and out of concern for everyone's safety. So I wanted to take a few minutes and share with you some of my thoughts that I would share with you in the worship services if we were together in worship. We're in a series of sermons called Christmas Inside Out, and we had no idea, of course, that we would be inside this weekend rather than getting out and being together in worship. And our theme for this particular weekend of Advent is outside the expectations. Christmas outside the expectations. Well, this weekend is certainly outside of our expectations. We expected to be together in worship. We expected full orchestra and choir and a wonderful program of music and worship. We expected to be together in our beautiful sanctuary to enjoy the new organ, the portions of the organ that are already up and running, and how great that would have been. But that is not what in fact happened. Something outside of our expectations happened. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about this theme for this weekend and to give you some things to think about. I want to ask you to think about the Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke, the 2nd chapter, the first 20 verses. I invite you to pause the video and to take a Bible and to read those verses or to read them online as we think about those passages together. Christmas outside the expectation. As you think about that, think about the words of the early prophets as they thought about the coming of the Messiah, as they expressed the people's yearning for God to intervene in their lives, to come into the difficult circumstances of their lives, as they yearned for the coming of a Messiah, a leader who would lead with justice and lead them into peace. The prophets expressed this in many different ways. One of those is expressed by the prophet Isaiah in the 64th chapter. What he's doing is he's speaking for the people. He's speaking with their voice, and he's saying, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains would shake with your presence." You can hear in that the expectation was that if God came into the world in any way at all, it would be spectacular. It would be completely out of the ordinary. But of course, we see in that passage from Luke's Gospel that it was in fact quite ordinary. An ordinary family doing something quite ordinary, that is, going to a place to register for the purposes of taxation. And that they were experiencing something that's quite ordinary, though meaningful and something that is a great celebration for a family. It's just something that happens all the time, the birth of a child. And yet, don't we sometimes expect that God will be present in our lives in a certain way? We have an expectation. For some, the expectation is if God is present in any way, it will be spectacular, quite out of the ordinary. For others, the expectation is, well, that God doesn't really show up at all. But Christmas is outside the expectation. Think about that for your own life. As I think about that, I remember as a child going to a summer camp of another denomination, and the expectation was that when you became a Christian, that something spectacular would happen to you, that you would have all of these magnificent feelings, and you would be compelled to walk down the aisle at the end of the service that happened every night and accept Christ. I was in all those services. I never felt anything extraordinary or spectacular. And so I wondered if God cared about me at all, if God was present at all. It was only later that I learned that people experience God in so many different ways. For some, it is spectacular, it is momentous, it's noisy, it is dramatic when they experience God. For others, they come to faith as quietly as a child growing up in a loving family, or as subtly as the spring comes and the grass turns green and the flowers bloom. It's outside of the expectations when something else happens that you're not expecting. Many people expected the dramatic, and yet Christ was born in a way that was quite ordinary. Think about the prophet Elijah, who went to the mountain of God expecting God to appear, and he knew how God appeared at the mountain of God. I mean, he had known the stories that when God showed up, it would be so dramatic, and earthquake and wind and fire, and Elijah waited, and sure enough, there came a great earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And there came a fire, a consuming fire, and God was not in the fire. And then there was this dramatic wind that even broke the rocks in pieces, but God was not in the wind either. In all those ways that Elijah expected, God was not present. But then there came a still small voice, or as it's better translated, the sound of sheer silence. And it was in that silence, it was in that still small voice that Elijah experienced the presence of God. Unexpected, but God was there. We receive what we need to receive in ways that are often unexpected. Sue Monk Kidd writes in one of her books about early in her journey to faith. She was visiting a monastery, and she ran into a monk outside the gates of the monastery. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, and so she greeted him in the expected way. "Merry Christmas," she said. She expected Merry Christmas in return, but instead he said to her, "May Christ be born in you." At that time in her life, she really had no idea what that meant. It was outside the expected Christmas greeting. But the words stuck with her. They were, in fact, the words that she needed to hear, and Christ indeed was born in her. And she came more and more to understand the import of those words. People also expected that if Messiah came, Messiah would come into royalty and privilege, but of course that's not what happened at all. Born into a poor family, not privileged at all. In fact, because of the whims of and the dictates of government, having to travel at the worst possible time to be enrolled for the purposes of taxation, they weren't privileged at all. People expected that it would be at the seat of power that Messiah would come, but that's not true at all. As a matter of fact, Messiah came in the small little town of Bethlehem, in an out-of-the-way place, to a poor family, and instead of being wrapped in royal purple, was swaddled in just plain old swaddling clothes. God shows up, but God shows up in unexpected ways, in ways that we don't anticipate. And we remember that in the season of Advent, that Christmas is outside the expected, outside of our expectations, outside of what we would otherwise anticipate. It is the very presence of God that we prepare for Christ in this season to be born in us, present with us in all the circumstances of our lives. A preschool is having a day where the kids would share what their fathers did, and the fathers were invited to come, but not many showed up. The children were talking about what their dads did with great pride. One little boy said, "My dad's a lawyer. He helps people in important ways." Another said, "My dad is a professor. He teaches important things." And one little boy said simply, "My dad My dad is here. And he captured what was most important, that his father was present with him. And not necessarily the answer anyone expected. His name is called Emmanuel, which means God with us. With us quite often in unexpected ways. There's a story that one pastor tells of setting up the nativity scene in their yard as they did every year. They dragged out all the usual figures. All the expected figures were there. The wise men, the shepherds, the animals, the baby Jesus, the manger, the stable scene, all set up. And their youngest child brought his favorite figure out to the yard. It was a rather large inflatable Tyrannosaurus Rex. Well, of course, the dad said, that really doesn't belong. Dinosaurs lived millions of years before the baby Jesus was born, so we don't want to put that in the nativity scene. But the little one insisted that the T-Rex be a part of it. So rather than fight it, they left the T-Rex there as they backed up and they looked at the nativity scene on their yard. And all the expected things were there except for this unexpected figure, the T-Rex, looking vicious, sort of towering over the other figures. And then it occurred to the dad that perhaps there's a message there, an unexpected message to be sure. And that is that the menacing T-Rex perhaps reminds us that in the midst of the menacing things in our lives, in the midst of the difficulties and the threats in our lives, that God is present with us and that God has come into those situations in a special way, and we are not alone. That indeed there is Emmanuel, God with us. The presence of God. Something unexpected happened to a family in our church at Thanksgiving. James and Carol Van Hook and their family, gathered for Thanksgiving, had the unexpected surprise of their lieutenant colonel son, stationed in Afghanistan, appearing. He walked around the corner and there he was, completely unexpected, this great gift. And it reminded them of the love they have for one another. It reminded them of what the meaning of Thanksgiving and then Advent and Christmas is all about, that it is about the love that we experience in God and the love that we share with others. And it was so unexpected, and yet it was just the gift they needed. Well, this weekend is unexpected. This is not what we had in mind at all. But perhaps it's what we need. Time where we can quietly contemplate the meaning of the season. Time when we can be together, perhaps, with family or with friends. Time when we can have our own experience of worship. When we can quietly read the Christmas story and think about what it means. Perhaps this unexpected weekend can be exactly what we need in this Advent season. Because Christmas is outside the expected. So I want to say to you, not Merry Christmas just yet, but in the words of that monk, may Christ be born in you. Grace and peace to you. God bless you. Amen.